The towering skyscrapers of downtown cast long shadows over the neglected streets below, a stark reminder of the city's dual nature. In one of these forgotten corners, Samuel Johnson, a 52-year-old homeless man, was about to experience a twist of fate that would turn his world upside down and change his life forever. When an unexpected four-legged companion enters Samuel's life, it seems like a glimmer of light in his dark world. As their bond grows stronger, Samuel begins to rediscover a sense of purpose he thought was lost forever. But how could this chance encounter lead to a confrontation that would shake the foundations of Samuel's existence? And what surprising chain of events could transform a tale of hardship into something neither Samuel nor anyone else could have anticipated? Let's find out, but before we dive into Samuel's extraordinary story, leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button. As the first light of dawn broke over the city, Samuel stirred within his tent. His weathered hands reached for the tattered blanket, pulling it closer to ward off the morning chill. The sounds of the awakening city filtered through the thin fabric, car horns honking, the distant rumble of the subway, and the chatter of early morning commuters hurrying to their jobs. Samuel emerged from his tent, his dark skin marked with lines that spoke of hardship and sorrow. His once proud shoulders now slumped under the weight of his circumstances. He ran a hand over his salt and pepper beard, grimacing at the tangles. It had been weeks since he'd had access to a proper shower or a mirror. As he began his daily routine of packing up his few possessions before the local beat cop made his rounds, Samuel's mind drifted back to a time when life held promise. He could almost smell the aroma of his wife Marie's cooking, hear the laughter of his children, Tyrone and Aisha, as they played in the backyard of their modest home. That life seemed like a distant dream now, shattered by a single night of tragedy. Samuel closed his eyes, the memories washing over him like a tidal wave of grief. It had been a crisp autumn evening, much like this one. Samuel had just finished a long shift at the construction site where he worked as a skilled carpenter. He was looking forward to a quiet night with his family, maybe watching a movie or helping the kids with their homework. But fate had other plans. The call came just as he was pulling into their driveway. Marie's voice was frantic on the other end of the line. There had been an accident. Tyrone and Aisha were being rushed to the hospital. Samuel's world tilted on its axis as he sped towards the emergency room, his heart pounding in his chest. The next few hours were a blur of stark white corridors, the antiseptic smell of the hospital, and the grim faces of doctors. By morning, Samuel's world had irrevocably changed. Marie and the children were gone, victims of a drunk driver who had run a red light. Samuel, who had not been in the car, was left alone to face a world that suddenly seemed cold and meaningless. The following weeks and months were a haze of grief and pain. Samuel threw himself into his work, trying to outrun the emptiness that threatened to consume him. But the physical demands of his job, coupled with his emotional distress, led to a severe back injury. Unable to perform his duties, Samuel found himself out of work and spiraling into depression. Alcohol became his solace, numbing the pain and allowing him to forget, if only for a few hours. But it also clouded his judgment and emptied his savings. Before long, Samuel could no longer afford the mortgage on the house that now felt hauntingly empty. Eviction notices piled up, ignored in his alcoholic stupor. One cold morning, Samuel found himself on the street, a duffel bag of clothes his only possession. The transition to homelessness was swift and merciless. The skills that had once made him a valuable employee now seemed useless in a world that looked at him with suspicion and disdain. As Samuel finished packing his meager belongings, he steeled himself for another day of begging on the streets. He had long since given up on finding work. Who would hire a homeless black man with a history of alcoholism? The thought brought a bitter taste to his mouth. He made his way to his usual spot near the busy intersection, his cardboard sign tucked under his arm. The sign read, "Hungry and homeless, any help appreciated. God bless." Samuel settled onto the cold pavement, propping the sign against his legs. The morning rush hour brought a steady stream of pedestrians, most averting their eyes as they hurried past. Some muttered under their breath, their words carrying thinly veiled racism. "Get a job," one man in a suit sneered as he passed. Samuel bit back a retort, knowing it would only make things worse. As the hours crawled by, Samuel couldn't help but notice the disparity in treatment between himself and the white homeless man who begged a block away. While Samuel's cup remained nearly empty, the other man's seemed to fill steadily throughout the day. The observation sent a fresh wave of hopelessness through Samuel. A group of teenagers approached, laughing and joking amongst themselves. As they neared Samuel, one of the boys nudged his friend. "Watch this," he said loudly, pulling out his wallet. He made a show of removing a $20 bill, waving it in front of Samuel's face. Hope flared in Samuel's chest, only to be cruelly extinguished as the boy tore the bill in half, letting the pieces flutter to the ground. The group erupted in laughter as they walked away, leaving Samuel to stare at the torn money, a stark reminder of his invisibility and the casual cruelty of others. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city streets, Samuel gathered his few coins and began the trek back to his tent. The day's meager earnings would barely buy him a meal, let alone help him escape his current situation. He felt the weight of despair settling over him like a heavy blanket. Back at his makeshift home, Samuel sat outside his tent, watching as the city transformed in the fading light. The streets that had been filled with bustling commuters and busy shoppers now took on a different character. The night people emerged, other homeless individuals, sex workers, and those who preferred to conduct their business in the shadows. Samuel pulled out a small battered notebook from his pocket. It was one of the few possessions he had managed to hold on to from his previous life. Opening it, he revealed a faded photograph tucked between the pages. The smiling faces of Marie, Tyrone, and Aisha looked back at him, frozen in a moment of happiness that seemed to belong to another lifetime. His fingers traced the outline of their faces as he whispered a quiet prayer. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I've become this." A single tear traced its way down his weathered cheek, falling onto the photograph. As the night deepened, Samuel retreated into his tent, curling up on his thin sleeping bag. The sounds of the city never truly faded. Distant sirens, the occasional shout, the rumble of late-night traffic. But for Samuel, the loudest sound was the relentless drumbeat of his own thoughts, a constant reminder of all he had lost, and the seemingly insurmountable obstacles that stood between him and any hope of a better life. Little did Samuel know that tomorrow would bring an unexpected encounter, one that would challenge his perceptions, rekindle his spirit, and set him on a path towards redemption and healing. But for now he closed his eyes, allowing exhaustion to pull him into a fitful sleep, dreaming of a life long lost and a future he could scarcely imagine. The following evening found Samuel in his usual routine, scavenging for food behind a bustling restaurant in the heart of the city. The air was thick with the aroma of grilled meats and spices, a cruel reminder of the meals he once shared with his family. Samuel's stomach growled audibly as he rifled through the dumpster, hoping to find something edible among the discarded scraps. His fingers closed around a half-eaten burger, still wrapped in its paper. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had all day. As he was about to take a bite, a sound caught his attention, a faint rustling coming from a nearby alley. Samuel paused, his senses on high alert. In his years on the street, he'd learned to be wary of unexpected noises. They could signal danger, a rival homeless person encroaching on his territory, or perhaps a stray animal looking for an easy meal. Curiosity overrode caution, and Samuel found himself moving towards the source of the sound. As he peered into the dimly lit alley, his eyes took a moment to adjust to the darkness. At first he saw nothing but scattered trash and empty cardboard boxes. Then a slight movement caught his eye. In the far corner of the alley, partially hidden behind a rusty garbage can, was a dog. But this was no ordinary stray. The animal was in a pitiful state, its ribs clearly visible through its matted, dirty fur. Its eyes, though, were what truly caught Samuel's attention. They were filled with a mixture of fear and desperation that Samuel recognized all too well. Samuel hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. The dog could be dangerous. Hungry animals often were, but as he watched, the dog made no aggressive moves. Instead, it seemed to shrink further into itself, as if trying to disappear into the shadows. "Hey there," Samuel called softly, his voice gravelly from disuse. The dog's ears perked up at the sound, but it made no move to approach or run away. Slowly, Samuel took a step forward, then another. The dog watched him warily but remained still. As Samuel drew closer, he could see just how dire the dog's condition was. Its coat, which might once have been a rich brown, was now a dull, muddy color, caked with dirt and what looked like dried blood in some places. One of its legs was held at an odd angle, suggesting an old injury that had never properly healed. Samuel's heart, hardened by years of struggle and disappointment, softened at the sight. Here was a creature even worse off than himself. Without thinking, he broke off a piece of the burger he'd been saving and held it out towards the dog. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice taking on a gentleness he hadn't used in years. "I'm not gonna hurt you. You hungry, boy?" The dog's nose twitched, catching the scent of food. Slowly, painfully, it began to inch forward. Samuel remained perfectly still, his arm outstretched, the morsel of food a peace offering between two lost souls. After what seemed like an eternity, the dog was close enough to sniff at Samuel's hand. Its cold, wet nose brushed against his fingers, sending a shiver down Samuel's spine. Then, with a quickness that belied its weakened state, the dog snatched the food and retreated a few steps. Samuel watched as the animal devoured the small piece of burger in seconds. When it was done, the dog looked up at him, its eyes now holding a glimmer of something new. Hope, perhaps, or at least a lessening of fear. Encouraged, Samuel broke off another piece of the burger and offered it again. This time the dog approached more quickly, taking the food gently from his hand. As it ate, Samuel slowly reached out and placed his hand on the dog's head. The animal flinched at first, but then leaned into the touch, as starved for affection as it was for food. "You're all alone too, huh?" Samuel said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Guess that makes two of us." As the night wore on, Samuel shared what remained of his meager meal with his new companion. He spoke to the dog in low, soothing tones, telling it about Marie and the kids, about the life he'd once had and the dreams he'd long since abandoned. The dog listened with what Samuel could have sworn was understanding, its tail occasionally thumping against the ground. When it came time for Samuel to return to his tent, he found himself facing a dilemma. He couldn't just leave the dog here. It was clearly in no condition to fend for itself. But taking on the responsibility of another life when he could barely care for himself seemed foolish at best. In the end, the decision was made for him. As Samuel stood to leave, the dog struggled to its feet and limped after him. It paused a few feet away, looking up at Samuel with those soulful eyes, as if asking permission to follow. Samuel sighed, a mix of resignation and something he hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of purpose. "All right," he said. "Come on then. But I can't promise you much." The dog's tail wagged slightly, and it fell into step beside Samuel as they made their way through the dark city streets. As they walked, Samuel found himself talking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Guess you need a name, huh? Can't just keep calling you dog." He thought for a moment, looking down at the animal padding silently beside him. In the dim streetlights, the dog's form was little more than a darker shadow against the night. "How about Shadow? That work for you?" The newly christened Shadow looked up at him and gave a soft whine, which Samuel took as agreement. They reached Samuel's tent just as the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Samuel held open the flap of his makeshift home, and Shadow limped inside without hesitation, curling up in the corner as if he'd always belonged there. As Samuel settled onto his thin sleeping bag, he felt the warmth of Shadow's body press against his side. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. The weight of his grief and despair seemed just a little lighter. "Good night, Shadow," Samuel murmured, his hand resting on the dog's bony back. As he drifted off to sleep, a tiny part of him dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Little did Samuel know that this unexpected companion would not only change his life, but also set in motion a series of events that would challenge his perceptions, restore his faith in humanity, and ultimately offer him a chance at redemption. But for now, man and dog slept, finding comfort in each other's presence as the city around them stirred to life. The days that followed brought a subtle but significant shift in Samuel's life. For the first time in years, he had a reason to wake up beyond mere survival. Shadow's presence, though demanding in its own way, provided a sense of purpose that Samuel had long forgotten. Each morning, Samuel would emerge from his tent with Shadow at his heels. The dog's limp was still pronounced, but there was a new energy in his step. Samuel found himself talking more, explaining their daily routines to Shadow as if the dog could understand every word. "All right, boy," Samuel would say as they set out each day. "Let's see what we can scrounge up for breakfast." Shadow would wag his tail in response, his eyes never leaving Samuel's face. Their foraging expeditions took on a new dimension. Samuel found himself more aware of his surroundings, always on the lookout for scraps that might be suitable for a dog. He began to time their visits to certain dumpsters, learning the schedules of local restaurants and when they were most likely to discard edible food. One morning, about a week after Shadow's appearance, Samuel struck gold. Behind a high-end cafe, he found a bag of day-old pastries, slightly stale but still perfectly edible. The smile that spread across his face as he held up a croissant for Shadow to sniff was the first genuine one to grace his features in months. "Look at this, Shadow," he said, breaking off a piece for the dog. "We're dining like kings today." As Shadow eagerly gobbled up the offered treat, Samuel found himself chuckling. The sound of his own laughter, rusty from disuse, startled him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd found joy in something so simple. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Samuel shared his meager resources without hesitation, often giving Shadow the larger portion of whatever food they managed to find. He told himself it was because the dog needed to regain its strength, but deep down he knew it was more than that. Caring for Shadow gave him a sense of responsibility, a feeling that he mattered to someone again. During quiet moments, Samuel would talk to Shadow, sharing memories of his past life. He spoke of Marie's laugh, of Tyrone's passion for basketball, of Aisha's dreams of becoming a doctor. Shadow would listen attentively, his head tilted to one side, occasionally offering a soft whine or a gentle lick of Samuel's hand when the memories became too painful. "You know, Shadow," Samuel said one evening as they sat outside his tent, watching the sun set over the city skyline, "I used to be somebody, had a good job, a family, a future." He sighed, absent-mindedly scratching behind Shadow's ears. "Never thought I'd end up here, talking to a dog in an alley." Shadow nuzzled closer, as if sensing Samuel's melancholy. The warmth of the dog's body against his side was a comfort Samuel hadn't realized he'd been missing. As the days turned into weeks, Samuel noticed subtle changes in both Shadow and himself. The dog's coat, though still matted and dirty, had begun to regain some of its luster. His ribs were less prominent, and his limp, while still present, had improved. Shadow's eyes, once dull with pain and hunger, now shone with affection whenever they met Samuel's gaze. But it wasn't just Shadow who was changing. Samuel found himself standing a little straighter, his shoulders no longer quite so burdened by the weight of his past. He began to take more care with his appearance, using public restrooms to wash up when he could, combing his beard with his fingers to keep it somewhat tidy. However, life on the streets remained harsh, and Samuel was acutely aware of the challenges they faced. The issue of racism, always an undercurrent in his daily life, seemed to become more pronounced now that he had Shadow by his side. One afternoon, as Samuel and Shadow made their way down a busy street, a well-dressed woman approached. Her eyes lit up at the sight of Shadow, and for a moment, Samuel dared to hope for a friendly interaction. "Oh, what a sweet dog," the woman exclaimed, bending down to pet Shadow. But as her gaze traveled up to Samuel, her expression changed. She straightened abruptly, clutching her purse closer to her body. "I hope you're taking good care of it," she said, her tone now cold and accusatory. Samuel felt a familiar wave of anger and frustration wash over him. "I'm doing my best, Ma'am," he replied, struggling to keep his voice even. The woman's lips thinned into a disapproving line. "Well, maybe you should consider finding it a proper home. Someone who can actually provide for it." With that, she hurried away, leaving Samuel standing there, his fists clenched at his sides. Shadow whined softly, pressing against Samuel's leg. The contact grounded him, helping to dissipate some of his anger. "It's okay, boy," he murmured, more to himself than to Shadow. "We've got each other. That's what matters." As the weeks passed, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing in the city. There seemed to be more police patrols in the wealthier areas, and he overheard snippets of conversations about recent break-ins. The tension in the air was palpable, and Samuel found himself growing increasingly uneasy. One afternoon, as he and Shadow made their way through a more affluent neighborhood in search of food, Samuel noticed a group of well-dressed people huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. As he passed, he caught fragments of their conversation. "Another break-in last night. Getting worse. Need to increase security." Samuel quickened his pace, pulling Shadow along with him. He knew from experience that when the wealthy felt threatened, it often meant trouble for people like him. The last thing he needed was to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. As they turned a corner, Samuel nearly collided with a police officer. The officer's hand immediately went to his weapon, his eyes narrowing as he took in Samuel's appearance. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" the officer demanded, his tone hostile. Samuel's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Just passing through, sir," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "My dog and I, we don't mean any trouble." The officer's gaze shifted to Shadow, who was pressed against Samuel's leg, sensing his tension. For a moment, the officer's expression softened slightly. "Make sure you keep moving," he said finally, his tone slightly less aggressive. "This isn't a good area for you to be hanging around in." Samuel nodded, relief washing over him. "Yes, sir, thank you, sir." He tugged gently on Shadow's makeshift leash, and they continued on their way, Samuel's heart still pounding in his chest. That night, as they settled into their tent, Samuel held Shadow close, finding comfort in the dog's steady presence. "We've got to be more careful, boy," he whispered. "Things are changing out there, and not for the better." Little did Samuel know just how prophetic those words would prove to be. The city was indeed changing, and events were already in motion that would soon collide with his world in ways he could never have anticipated. The day that would change everything started like any other. Samuel woke early, the first light of dawn barely visible through the worn fabric of his tent. Shadow stirred beside him, tail thumping softly against the ground in greeting. Despite the weight of his recent worries, Samuel couldn't help but smile at the dog's unwavering affection. "Morning, boy," he murmured, running a hand through Shadow's fur, ready to face another day. They emerged from the tent into the crisp morning air. The city was just beginning to wake up, the usual cacophony of traffic and bustling pedestrians still muted. Samuel took a moment to stretch, his joints protesting after another night on the hard ground. Shadow mimicked him, extending his front legs in a long, luxurious stretch that made Samuel chuckle despite himself. As they made their usual rounds, checking dumpsters behind restaurants and cafes, Samuel's mind wandered to the increasing tension he'd been noticing in the city. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the sudden change in the atmosphere around them. It was Shadow who alerted him first, the dog's ears perking up at a sound Samuel couldn't yet hear. Then he saw it, people on the street stopping, turning to look at something approaching. The sleek black Mercedes sedan seemed out of place in this run-down part of the city, their polished surfaces reflecting the morning sunlight. They moved slowly down the street, drawing everyone's attention. Samuel felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in his stomach. Expensive cars in this neighborhood usually meant trouble. To his surprise, the cars began to slow as they approached his spot. Shadow pressed closer to his side, sensing his unease. Samuel's hand instinctively went to the dog's head, both for Shadow's comfort and his own. The lead car came to a stop directly in front of them. For a moment, nothing happened. Samuel held his breath, unsure of what to expect. Then the rear door of the first Mercedes opened. A man stepped out, and Samuel's first thought was that he'd never seen anyone look so out of place in this neighborhood. The man's suit probably cost more than Samuel had seen in years. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled. His shoes shined to a mirror finish. This was a man accustomed to power and respect. As the man straightened, smoothing down his jacket, Samuel caught a glimpse of someone else in the car, a woman, perhaps. But before he could get a better look, his attention was drawn to the driver's side of the car, where another man was emerging. This second man was a stark contrast to the first. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the practiced ease of someone ready for trouble. His eyes scanned the area, taking in every detail, before settling on Samuel and Shadow. The look in those eyes made Samuel's skin crawl. It was the look of someone assessing a threat. The rear door of the second car opened, and two women stepped out. The older of the two was clearly the first man's wife. They had the same air of wealth and privilege about them. She was elegantly dressed, her jewelry catching the morning light. But it was her expression that caught Samuel's attention, a mix of distress and determination. The younger woman, barely out of her teens by the look of her, seemed overwhelmed by her surroundings. Her eyes darted nervously from side to side, never settling on one spot for long. When she saw Samuel and Shadow, however, her gaze locked onto them with an intensity that made Samuel deeply uncomfortable. A second man, as imposing as the first, exited the driver's side of the second car, taking up a protective stance near the women. The message was clear. These people were important, and they were prepared for any eventuality. Samuel's mind raced. What could these people possibly want in this neighborhood? And why had they stopped here, of all places? He felt exposed, vulnerable, acutely aware of his shabby appearance and Shadow's presence at his side. The well-dressed man, clearly the leader of this group, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area before settling on Samuel. There was something in his gaze that made Samuel's heart race, a mix of anger and determination that boded ill. "You there," the man called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to being obeyed. "With the dog, come here." Samuel hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to grab Shadow and run. But where would he go? And what if these people decided to chase him? In his condition, with Shadow to think about, he wouldn't get far. Slowly, Samuel got to his feet, one hand resting protectively on Shadow's head. The dog pressed close to his leg, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Easy, boy," Samuel murmured, trying to project a calm he didn't feel. As Samuel approached, he could feel the eyes of everyone on the street upon him. Passers-by had stopped to watch the scene unfold, no doubt as confused and curious as he was about what these wealthy people were doing in this part of town. The man's lips curled in distaste as Samuel drew near, and he made a show of taking a step back, as if afraid Samuel's poverty might be contagious. "That's far enough," he said, holding up a hand. Up close, Samuel could see the barely contained fury in the man's eyes. Whatever had brought him here, it wasn't good. The woman who had exited the car with him, his wife, Samuel assumed, placed a hand on his arm as if to restrain him. "Robert," she said softly, her voice tight with tension, "let's not jump to conclusions." The man, Robert, shrugged off her hand, his gaze never leaving Samuel. "I know what I'm doing, Caroline," he said, his tone brooking no argument. Samuel cleared his throat, finding his voice. "Excuse me, sir," he said, fighting to keep his tone neutral. "Is there something I can help you with?" Robert's eyes narrowed. "Don't play dumb with me," he snapped. "You know exactly why we're here." Confusion and fear warred within Samuel. He had no idea what this man was talking about, but it was clear that saying so would only anger him further. Before he could formulate a response, movement from the second car caught his attention. The younger woman had taken a step forward, her eyes fixed on Shadow. There was a look of recognition on her face, mixed with something else. Hope, maybe. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the older woman, Caroline, quickly pulled her back. "Emily, wait!" Caroline hissed. "Let your father handle this." Robert took another step towards Samuel, and this time Shadow's growl became audible. The bodyguards tensed, their hands moving to their sides where Samuel was sure they carried weapons. "Sir," Samuel said, fighting to keep his voice steady, "I think there's been some kind of mistake. I don't know who you are or what you want, but—" "Shut up!" Robert's voice cracked like a whip, causing Samuel to flinch. "I know exactly what kind of person you are, thieves, all of you, taking what doesn't belong to you without a thought for the people you hurt." Samuel's confusion gave way to indignation. "Now wait just a minute," he began, but Robert cut him off again. "No, you wait," Robert snarled. "That dog, where did you get it?" Samuel blinked, caught off guard by the question. He looked down at Shadow, who was still pressed against his leg, hackles raised. I found him," Samuel said. "In an alley a few weeks back. He was half-starved, injured. I've been taking care of him." Robert's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Taking care of him? Look at the state of you. You can barely take care of yourself." The words stung, but Samuel fought back the anger rising in his chest. Getting into an argument with this man would only lead to trouble. "Sir, I don't know what you think I've done, but—" "Emily," Robert called over his shoulder, not taking his eyes off Samuel. "Come here, tell me if this is Rex." The young woman, Emily, stepped forward hesitantly. As she drew closer, Shadow's demeanor changed. His growl faded, replaced by a curious whine. His tail, usually held low, began to wag hesitantly. Emily's eyes widened, filling with tears. "Rex," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Is that really you?" To Samuel's shock, Rex responded to the name. He took a step towards Emily, his tail now wagging furiously. "It is him!" Emily cried, dropping to her knees and holding out her arms. "Oh, Rex!" Rex looked up at Samuel as if seeking permission. In that moment, Samuel felt his world tilt on its axis. The dog he'd come to love, the companion who'd given him a reason to keep going, wasn't his at all. I don't understand," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found him. He was alone, starving." Robert's voice cut through Samuel's confusion like a knife. "You expect us to believe that our purebred dog just happened to end up in an alley, and you just happened to find him? Do you have any idea how much that dog is worth?" The implications of Robert's words hit Samuel like a physical blow. "You think I stole him?" he said, disbelief coloring his tone. "Sir, I swear to you, I would never—" "Save it," Robert snapped. "I've heard enough of your lies. We were robbed last night. The thief took jewelry, cash, and Rex, and then you had the audacity to pretend you'd found him when we tracked you down." Samuel's mind reeled. "What? No, I would never—" "Emily, get Rex and let's go," Robert ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We're done here." As Emily gently took hold of Rex's collar, Samuel felt as if his heart was being torn from his chest. Rex looked back at him, confusion evident in his brown eyes. It was more than Samuel could bear. "Wait," he said, his voice cracking. "Please, just let me say goodbye." Robert's face contorted with disgust. "Goodbye? You think you deserve to say goodbye to a dog you stole?" He sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You should be thankful we're not having you arrested. Frankly, it would be a waste of taxpayer money to put someone like you in prison anyway." The cruel words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He stood there, stunned, as Emily led Rex away. The dog whined, looking back at Samuel with confusion and what seemed like regret. But there was nothing Samuel could do. He watched helplessly as they loaded Rex into one of the Mercedes. As the cars pulled away, Leaving nothing but a cloud of exhaust and a hollow feeling in Samuel's chest, he sank to his knees. The reality of what had just happened crashed over him like a wave. Rex was gone. The one bright spot in his life, the companion who had given him hope and a reason to keep going, had been taken away. For the first time in years, Samuel put his head in his hands and wept, his sobs echoing in the indifferent streets of the city that had taken everything from him, again and again. The days that followed Rex's departure were some of the darkest Samuel had experienced since losing his family. The absence of the dog's comforting presence left a void that seemed to consume everything. Samuel found himself going through the motions of survival without any real purpose, his thoughts constantly returning to Rex and the family that had taken him away. As word of the confrontation spread through the neighborhood, Samuel noticed a marked change in how people treated him. Where before he had been largely ignored, now he was actively avoided. People crossed the street when they saw him coming, clutching their bags closer and throwing fearful glances his way. The other homeless individuals in the area, once if not friendly, then at least tolerant of his presence, now kept their distance. Samuel overheard whispered conversations, fragments of gossip about the thief who had targeted a wealthy family. Some expressed admiration for his supposed boldness, while others condemned him for bringing unwanted attention to their community. One night, as Samuel huddled in his usual spot, trying to find warmth in the threadbare blanket that was one of his few remaining possessions, he was suddenly surrounded by a group of rough-looking men. He recognized them as other homeless individuals from the area, their faces twisted with anger and desperation. "You've caused us nothing but trouble," one of them snarled. "The cops are everywhere now, hassling all of us because of you." Before Samuel could protest or explain, they were on him. Samuel curled into a ball, trying to protect himself as best he could, but he was outnumbered and caught off guard. When it was over, the men disappeared into the night, taking with them the few possessions Samuel had left: his blanket, his small stash of food, even the battered notebook containing the photo of his family. As he lay there, exhausted and bruised, Samuel felt the last remnants of his hope slip away. Samuel found himself more isolated than ever before. His usual spots for begging and scavenging were now off-limits, guarded jealously by others who saw him as a threat to their own precarious existence. He was forced to venture further afield in search of food and safe places to sleep, always looking over his shoulder, always wary of running into Robert or the police. One particularly cold night, about a week after the confrontation with Robert, Samuel huddled in the doorway of an abandoned building, trying to escape the biting wind. His stomach growled painfully, a constant reminder of how little he'd eaten in the past days. As he pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself, his thoughts drifted to Rex. Was the dog safe and warm? Was he being well fed, well cared for? Despite everything that had happened, Samuel couldn't bring himself to resent Rex or even the family that had taken him. He just hoped that Rex was happy that all the hardship they'd endured together had led to a better life for the dog. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, Samuel's dreams were filled with memories of his past life. He saw Marie's smiling face, heard Tyrone's laughter as they played basketball in the driveway, felt Aisha's small hand in his as they walked to the park. The dreams shifted, and suddenly Rex was there too, running and playing with his children, barking joyfully as Samuel threw a stick for him to fetch. Samuel woke with a start, tears streaming down his face. The pain of loss, both old and new, threatened to overwhelm him. In that moment, the temptation he had resisted for weeks while caring for Rex now called to him with renewed strength. Samuel stood at the corner of the street, his gaze fixed on the flickering neon sign of the liquor store across the road. His hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from the internal struggle raging within him. For weeks since losing Rex, he had resisted the siren call of alcohol, clinging to the memory of the dog's unwavering loyalty and the promise he'd made to himself to stay sober. But now, with Rex gone and his world shattered once again, the temptation was almost unbearable. Samuel took a step towards the store, then stopped, his conscience warring with his despair. He thought of Rex, of how disappointed the dog would be to see him like this. But then the memory of Robert's sneering face and cruel words flooded back, drowning out everything else. "Just one bottle," Samuel muttered to himself, his voice hoarse, just to take the edge off. With a heavy heart, he crossed the street and entered the store. The harsh fluorescent lights made him squint, and he felt exposed, vulnerable. He shuffled to the back where the cheapest liquor was kept, acutely aware of the cashier's eyes following him. As he reached for a bottle, a familiar voice called out, "Samuel, is that you?" Samuel turned to see Mr. Chen, the owner of the small grocery store, where he and Rex used to scavenge for discarded produce. Mr. Chen's kind face was etched with concern. "I heard what happened," Mr. Chen said softly, approaching Samuel. "With the dog and the accusations, I'm so sorry, my friend." Samuel's throat tightened, unable to form words. Mr. Chen's kindness, so unexpected in the face of everything that had happened, threatened to unravel the fragile control he had over his emotions. "You know," Mr. Chen continued, gently taking the bottle from Samuel's hand and replacing it on the shelf, "I have some soup left over from dinner. My wife always makes too much. Why don't you come to the store and have some? It's much better than this stuff." For a moment Samuel was tempted. The offer of a warm meal and compassion was almost enough to break through his despair. But the pain of losing Rex, the humiliation of being labeled a thief, and the crushing weight of his circumstances overwhelmed him. I can't, Mr. Chen," Samuel mumbled, reaching again for the bottle. "Thank you, but I just can't." Mr. Chen's face fell, but he nodded in understanding. Samuel paid for the liquor with his meager earnings, avoiding Mr. Chen's gaze. As he left the store, he heard Mr. Chen call out, "Take care of yourself, Samuel, please." But Samuel was already retreating into the numbing embrace of his addiction. He made his way to a secluded alley, his usual spot since losing his tent. With shaking hands, Samuel reached into his bag and pulled out the cheap bottle of liquor. As the alcohol burned its way down his throat, he found himself talking to the empty space beside him where Rex should have been. "I'm sorry, boy," he slurred, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry I let you down." In the weeks that followed, Samuel's condition deteriorated rapidly. He drank more, begged less, and slowly began to lose the will to go on. The accusation of theft hung over him like a dark cloud, making it even harder to find odd jobs or assistance. People who might have once spared him some change or a kind word now crossed the street to avoid him. His appearance, which he had started to take care of during his time with Rex, once again became unkempt. His beard grew wild, his clothes dirtier and more ragged. The spark of hope that had begun to flicker in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a dull, hopeless gaze. Samuel's days blurred together in a haze of alcohol and despair. He moved from one makeshift shelter to another, never staying in one place for long, always on the edge of consciousness. The city that had once seemed full of potential, even in its harshest moments, now felt like a vast, uncaring wasteland. It was in this state, drunk, disheveled, and at the very edge of despair, that fate intervened once again. Samuel was slumped in a doorway, a nearly empty bottle clutched in his hand, when he heard a familiar voice. "Caroline, Emily, over here, I've found him." He looked up, his vision blurry, to see Robert standing there. But this time the man's face wore an expression of shock and remorse rather than anger. "Oh my God," Robert said softly. "What have we done?" As Samuel struggled to focus, he saw that Robert wasn't alone. His wife and daughter were there too, and between them, straining at his leash, was Rex. "Rex," Samuel whispered, sure he must be hallucinating. The dog barked once, tail wagging furiously, and lunged forward. Before anyone could stop him, he had reached Samuel and was licking his face, whining with joy. "I'm so sorry," Robert was saying, his voice choked with emotion. "We were wrong. So terribly wrong. The real thief was caught last week. He confessed to everything, including leaving a door open, which allowed Rex to escape. We've been searching for you ever since, to apologize, to make things right." But Samuel barely heard him. All he could focus on was the warm, solid presence of the dog in his arms, the familiar scent, the unconditional love pouring from those brown eyes. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of hope rekindling in his heart. As the family continued to speak, explaining and apologizing, Samuel held onto Rex like a lifeline. He didn't know what the future held, couldn't begin to process the implications of what they were saying. But he knew one thing for certain: with Rex back by his side, he had a reason to try again, to fight his way back from the brink. Robert cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. Johnson, Samuel, what we did to you was unforgivable. We jumped to conclusions based on prejudice, plain and simple. We can never fully make amends for that, but we'd like to try." Caroline stepped forward, her eyes brimming with tears. "We've been thinking, if you're willing, we'd like to offer you a job. As a caretaker for our animals, including Rex, and to help with some tasks around the house and garden." Emily nodded eagerly. "You'd have your own room in our house, and you could be with Rex every day." Samuel looked at them, stunned. He glanced down at Rex, who was still pressed against him, tail wagging, then back at the family. Could this be real? A chance to start over, to have a home again, to be with Rex? I don't know what to say," Samuel said, his voice hoarse. Robert held out his hand. "Say you'll give us a chance to make this right, to learn from our mistakes and to offer you the opportunity you deserve. We want to help, if you'll let us." With trembling fingers, Samuel reached out and took Robert's hand. As he was helped to his feet, Rex dancing around them excitedly, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Real, tangible hope for a better future. The transition wasn't easy. Samuel struggled with the sudden change in his circumstances, often feeling out of place in the Mitchells' grand home. There were moments when the temptation to return to his old life, to the numbing comfort of alcohol, was almost overwhelming. But Rex was always there, a constant reminder of why he was fighting to change his life. Slowly but surely, Samuel began to heal. He threw himself into his work, finding satisfaction in caring for the animals and tending to the garden. His carpentry skills, long dormant, came back to life as he took on small projects around the house. The Mitchells, true to their word, treated him with respect and kindness, always mindful of the debt they owed him. Rex, of course, was Samuel's constant companion. The dog seemed to sense when Samuel was having a difficult day, always there with a comforting nuzzle or an invitation to play. In caring for Rex and the other animals, Samuel rediscovered the sense of purpose he had lost so long ago. As the months passed, Samuel's relationship with the Mitchells deepened. Robert, once so quick to judge, now sought Samuel's advice on various matters. Caroline included him in family dinners and outings, and Emily, with her youthful enthusiasm, drew Samuel out of his shell, encouraging him to share stories of his past life and dreams for the future. One evening, as Samuel sat on the back porch with Rex at his feet, watching the sunset, he realized something profound. The hole in his heart left by the loss of his family would never fully heal, but it had been filled with something new. Not a replacement, but a different kind of family. One born of redemption, second chances, and the transformative power of compassion. Samuel reached down to scratch behind Rex's ears, smiling as the dog leaned into his touch. "We made it, boy," he said softly. "We finally made it home." Rex's tail wagged in response, his eyes fixed on Samuel with unwavering loyalty. Inside the house, Samuel could hear the Mitchells preparing dinner, the sounds of laughter and warmth floating through the open windows. It was a far cry from the lonely nights on the streets, yet Samuel knew he would never forget where he came from or how close he had come to losing everything. In the end, Rex proved to be more than just a companion. He was Samuel's guardian angel, a beacon of hope that guided him from the brink of despair to a new life filled with purpose and belonging. Without that fateful encounter in the alley, who knows what might have become of Samuel? As the stars twinkled in the night sky, Samuel sat on the porch with Rex by his side, reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of hopelessness to the warmth of a new family, their story was a testament to the power of second chances and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. If you were in Samuel's position, would you have found the strength to help a stray dog while at the lowest point of your life? And after everything that happened, could you have found it in your heart to forgive Robert and accept his offer? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you liked Samuel and Rex's journey of hope and second chances, I invite you to subscribe to my channel. I pour my heart into crafting these heartwarming stories for you, and your support is what keeps me going. I appreciate having you on this journey.